Okay, great. Okay. So good morning once again and welcome to today's session. So this is, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be a revision session and we are going to look at all the features that we have seen so far. So I'm going to do a quick recap and go through all the features from step 1 till what we learned yesterday. So as now we are already familiar with, this is the Erwin Data Modeler tool and this is the workspace. So the first step is to create a new data model. Create a new data model. We go to either to the file option, click on new, or we click on the new icon bar over here, the create model icon bar over here. So once we click on this, we would get this create model dialog box that would give us the option to create either only a logical, a physical only, or a logical physical model. So for our convenience, we'll go for the logical physical model so that we are able to see how the physical model is coming along as we are designing the logical model. So that is the advantage of selecting the logical / physical option so that we can check the progress of the physical model uh, as soon as we are going to make changes in the logical model. Now, the other option, important option over here is to select your target database. Now, each model of Erwin is compatible with some versions of the databases, and there's a long list of databases it is compatible with. So you can select your target database, whichever is being used in your project. So for now, let it be SQL Server. That's okay for us. So click on OK, and we'll get this display screen. This is a display screen for the model that we have created. Now this model, by default, it is getting named as model_1. We can right click, go to properties, and then we can change the name and give it any name that we want. So we want our data model to be of a particular name relating to the project that we are working on. So we can just rename this data model. So let's call it sample model for now. Then in this properties window, we can see a lot of other options are there which can be used. So we'll see later on how the dimension and data movement options would help and how the transform options would help. But the other options that we can look at right now are the definition. So you can define what your data model is for. So you can say that this sample model stores data about customers, let's say. So we can define it this way. And then the next tab is the notation tab, wherein we can choose the notation that we want to use for the display in a data model. Now there are only limited options that are provided here. It's either IDE F1X or IE. And if we are designing a data mart or a data warehouse, we can go for the dimension modeling option. So by default, it's selected IDE F1X. We can go for IE. That's a preferable option for many data models. So we can select that. Then we move on to the next tab, that is the default. So default, if you see that every time we add a column, we'll see once we add the column, every time by default, it would be created as a nullable column with the data type of char 18. So this can be changed on this default window. So we let it be for now. These are your relationships that you define. The delete, the child insert, all these are for the identifying, non-identifying. These are the actions that the database would take on its own, so we can leave them. UDP are any user-defined properties that need to be defined. They're rarely used. History options, whatever history is retained, and all this. So the important tabs in the model properties are your general tab, your notation tabs, your defaults if you want to change them. So these are your important tabs, which have important properties that you can select or unselect. So we'll see how these affect the model as we move along. So for now, what we've done, we've given a name to the data model. We can also assign an author to the data model. So if you want to assign some system ID or some data architect's name, that can be done over here as well. Let's say okay. So now we have a model. We have created a new model. It's called the sample underscore model. And we are in the logical view of this data model. Now, what is the next step? The next step is that we would have already identified the objects that are needed in this model. And now we need to create entities and add attributes, or we need to create tables and add columns to them. So if we go to the toolbar, we would see this option over here. This is your entities option. Just click on it and click here on your display, and an entity would be added. Now by default, an entity would also be named as something like E/1, but we are going to give it a meaningful name. So let's say it's a student entity. So we can define it as student. Now I want to move on and define my primary key. So how do you navigate over here? You can press your tab icon and you will move on to the second section, which would allow you to define a primary key for this. So you can define here student underscore ID, and then press a tab again and you will move to the column section or the attributes section, wherein you can define the various attributes for this entity. So let's say it's going to be student name, and just press an enter to define another attribute, and it's going to be let's say the birth date. So and then just click outside and you would get your columns defined in the entity. So now we have an entity called student. The primary key is student underscore ID, and the columns that we have added are student name and birth date. Now let's add another entity and click over here, and let's call it courses. So again, press a tab to define the primary key, which will be the course ID. And then again, press a tab to define the column. So course underscore name. All right, let's add that only one column. So now this is my entity called the courses. Now, let's say that I have created this table by mistake, courses, and let's say it's a big model. I've already created a lot of tables, and now I want to start doing my work again from this point. So I want to undo all the work that I have done, but only till the point where the courses entity was created. So for that purpose, we can go down here to this panel, which is your details and summary panel, and you'll see that every action that we take, so this is like an action log, every action that we have taken for designing this data model over here would be documented over here as a log record. So you can see this is rename entity E by 2, create attribute, create entity. So now what I want to do is I want to click on this create entity, which is referring to my courses entity. And if I right click, I can go over here and I can see an option undo to this point. So just click on this, and now I've undone all the actions that I have taken till the point the course entity was created. So this is how the action log can be used. Now we can see another window over here that is just giving some advice of the action that we have taken. So it's just suggesting what kind of action we have taken. This is the advisories panel. It would give you messages like this, suggesting what action we have taken. So this is only for the reference purpose. Now let's go back and add our entity. So we had created an entity called courses. Then put a tab, create your primary key, course underscore ID, then course underscore name, and that's all. So now we have two entities, student and courses. Now, since we had defined this as a logical physical model, it's a good idea that at this point I go and change my view to the physical data view and make a check over how it's coming along. So it's similar, student underscore ID, student underscore name, courses underscore ID, course underscore name. That's okay. Then going back to the logical view, there is something that you could note over here, that in the entity student, I had defined my student name attribute with a space in between. The attribute name here is student space name. But when I go on to the physical view, Erwin has automatically inserted an underscore between the two words. So student underscore name. Because in the physical database, you cannot have column names with spaces in between them. So this Erwin would do automatically for every space that's between the words for which you have defined an attribute name, it would automatically insert an underscore. This is how the physical model is coming along, and I'm fine with it so far. So let's go back to the student view. Now let's check the properties of the tables that we have created. So go and select your table and do a right click, and you would get an options like the entity properties, the attributes, the key groups. So for now, first I want to check the entity properties. So let's click on the entity properties. What all options I'm getting here? I'm getting this one, the entity name. I can change the entity name over here as well if I want to rename this entity. Then I'm getting this tab that asks me to define the or give a definition for the entity, which can be done. I can just put anything, volume matrix. I can define that how much initial rows I'm expecting, what are the maximum row size I'm expecting, what would be the group guide, put your notes and history. Okay. So these are your properties. So they are mostly descriptive properties. So we should not be worrying about them right now. But let's go back to the physical and check the table properties now. Again, click on this table and right click, go to tables, and let's check the properties over here. So now this is giving all the tables properties. So this is, we had two tables, courses and student, and it's giving us a general option where I can define some data space specific properties. I can define the partitions if I want to partition these properties. I can define some validation criteria, what is the validation rule, permission, comment, and so on. Okay, now let's go back to a logical view once again. And now let's right click and go to attributes and see what are the attribute properties. So the attribute properties, I can see all the attributes that I have defined. I can select an attribute and select rename and rename that attribute if I want to from here. I can also add a new attribute by pressing the button new and add a new attribute. Now for the attributes which are already added, so it added an attribute called default because I did not rename it and we do not own this attribute. So I would simply select this attribute and then click on delete over here. Now another thing that you can note on the screen is that the student ID is coming with an icon symbol for the primary key. And if we go down over here, we can see that the primary key is selected. I can deselect it over here and it would move to the columns, the attributes section. Now here we have this general tab, that's okay. Then we have the data type. Data type we can see over here is char 18, and that is what we saw in the model properties, that by default any column that we would add would be defined with the data type char 18. So that is what has been defined here. That is how it happened because I did not explicitly define my data type over here. But since it's an integer column, it's rarely likely that I would be having it as a string field. I need it to contain number value, so I need to define it as an integer column. So I'm going to go and change this data type and select the integer data type. So I'll select the integer. So I've made this change. You can see that the not nullable option is already grayed out. That's because we have defined it as a primary key. A primary key is always by default defined as a not nullable column. So that's why it is grayed out over here. Then the other options define any constraint, validation constraint. If we want on this column, we can define this column, put some notes and so on. So the only change I have made right now is to the nullability. I can just go and say okay, or let's first check the other columns as well. So the other column is student underscore name. I quickly want to check its data type. So go back to the data type and the char 18 would be there because that the default option in the models. I could have changed it if I wanted to. And then we have the not nullable option. We have this checkbox over here. So we, by default, this column, because that was an attribute column, it has been defined as a nullable column. I can go and check on this box over here and define it as a not nullable column. So that can be done. So let it be not nullable for now. You don't mind that. Then go to the birth date. Now birth date is also defined as char 18. I want it to be a date column. So I can just go and select date. And if I want, I can make it not nullable. Let's make it not nullable for now. I can add another column as we said. Otherwise, if I just want to save the changes we have done so far, I would just say okay. Now all these changes in the data types have been done. Similarly, I could go here and change the data types of the attribute column. Now let's go back to the physical and see if there are any differences in the column properties in the physical view. So we select on column, the entity student. The options that we're getting over here are general, that's okay, and SQL Server. So now it is converting it to the SQL Server specific data types. So char 18 is going to be a char over here. It's going to be not nullable because that is what we defined. We could have defined it as a nullable column as well. So you have some database specific properties over here. It's showing the SQL Server properties because while creating the data model, we selected the target data model to be SQL Server. So similar properties on the student level over here. Now let's go back to the logical. And now we have defined the entity, we have defined the primary key, we have defined the attributes. Now I just want to do some formatting, let's say. So these two are lying separated on my display window. I want them to come together. So just select your view, whatever you want to do. And you can do a lot of formatting with these options. So you can let's explore the various options we have in the toolbar now. So these ones we know, these are the create models, the open model. You can save your model over here. Then you have your attribute level view that we're seeing. So we can try to change that. So we'll do that in just a moment. And then we have, let's go back to the toolbar. So this over here, we can see that this section over here, this is align top, align bottom, align to the left or align to the right. So you can try different combinations, align top, but align them in the same line horizontally at the top, align bottom. So it would align the bottom line of the table, align left. So it has taken it over it. So we have to go like this and then, okay. Because both of them are selected, let's select one and move it away. This is your align left, and you have to select the whole data model, align right. That would be aligned towards the right. So you can align them properly so that you have a proper view of your data model. The other formatting options that you can see over here is you can, let's go and make this as bold. So now your entity name has been made as bold. You can make it as italics. You can do that. You can underline that. You can strike it out. And then these are your fonts. You can change your font. So these are the options in the font. Let's change your font. Let's make it 14. Now the entity name stands out from the other columns. So that can be done as well. Then you have some options over here of the diagrams. You can just put a rectangle. So here, if you want to put some information in there, you can write your text. So this like an annotation. This is the student university data model. You have your text properties. Again, you can change your font size. Let's say make it 12. Let's change it to something. Let's change the color. Okay, color and lines. What kind of borders you want, what kind of fill you want. So you can have a fill type could be solid, transparent, semi-transparent, pattern, whatever you want. So you have all these formatting options. You can just apply them. and this is how it gets formatted. So this is for the better visual graphics for your data model, and putting them in place is important because it helps you quickly see the important information in your data model. So it makes it more user friendly. It makes it easy to understand. So these things are these are the formatting things. So these are simple things, simple formatting things, nothing technical about them. But these are an important aspect in the sense that they do help a viewer to quickly look at the important information, get an idea. So if we had highlighted all our entity table names in this way, a person who would have quickly looked at a data model, which would have been much larger than this, he would have quickly got this information. Okay, these are the entity names. So it's an important thing to make it more viewable, more user friendly. So these things can be done. Now, once you have done all these things, you have done your formatting, you're following the procedure for formatting. Now let's go on and look at some other features. The next very important feature of the data model that we are going to create is something called the domain. So if you go on to the model pane over here on the left hand side, you can see that there's something called the domain. Now, if you expand this window, you'll see that there are some created by default over here. And before that, let's check out what these domains mean. So just click on this entity, let's say, and if you go to this part of the toolbar, you'll see that there are options like the entity level, the attribute level, and the definition level. So if we click on the entity level, now you would see only the entity names. If you click on the attribute level, you'll be able to see all your primary keys, all your attributes related to these entities. And if you click on the definition level, then if you would have defined a definition for this entity, you would have been able to see that definition over here. Okay, so let's go back to the attribute view. And now let's change our view mode to the physical view mode. And we are in the attribute view, the column view over here. Okay, and similarly it works for the description view over here and for the entity view over here. Okay, now let's just right click. I've just right clicked on the model and I'm going to the display level. And the display level over here is column. So because that is the column level. So you can also make your selection by right clicking over here and going to display level and selecting whatever you want. So there are some additional options over here. Comment you can select, the physical order you can select over here. Now going to the data table display level, we have these various options over here. We can see the column data type, we can see the column domain, the null option, the primary key designator, the alternate key, table owner, and so on. Let's select the column data type. Now what has changed? We can see that the data types are also visible along with the column names now. Let's go back to table display level. Now what do I want? I want to see the domain as well. So select on the domain. Now you can see that there is something called the data type is called integer over here, and then there is something called the default. Now this default is the domain that we saw on the left hand side over here. These are the domains, and you see that there's a default domain. So that is the one that is added by default to every column that you have created in the table. So that is what it is. It's a default domain. Now right click, go to table display level. I also want to see the null option. Then you can see your columns are not nullable or null. Now in this case, the course name is nullable column, so you can see that as null. Right, let's go back to the logical view. We have the same view over here. In the physical, we have changed this to be more descriptive. So this is also a good view, and it's a good view for distributing to your team, especially like the ETL people in your team or the technical people in your team, so they can quickly look at the table, understand what kind of data is there in the table, what are the data types, whether it's not nullable. So this is a good view. So you can expand your view in this way and include details like the data type, the domains, and the nullability. Now let's right click and say database view display. Views, it is there for the views. Now this we have created our entities, and this option is for the views. If you go back to the stored display settings, let's click on that. You will get this dialog box. In this dialog box, you can see, okay, you can see your display, the logical model, show dangling relationship. If you want to display shadows, how would be the relationship lines? You can define all that. For the logical model, you can define what all things you want to see. So you want to see the role name, name, attribute, data type, attribute, domain. So you can make these selections over here as well. And for the physical data types, we had already selected that we want to see the data type, domain, null option, and all those things. So you can make this selection in this dialog box as well, which comes through your right clicking on the module and going to the stored display setting. So you can go to the stored display setting, go to the logical view, and select whatever definitions or details you want to see within the entity in your logical view and in the physical view. So you can make all these changes over here. So now going back to the logical view, we would again be able to see data types and the domains that are associated with this data type because we made that selection in the stored display setting. Now here, as I said earlier, we can see a domain called the default domain. Now default domain, what exactly does domain mean? It's come to the left hand side, click on this, expand this panel, and see what is a domain. So for domains, yeah, basically your user created or Erwin provided column definition. So you can define your column definition to be, you can define a particular domain and define it to be always integer and not nullable. And then every time you add it to any of your tables, that is a data type that would be created for that column. So instead of going and adding an ID column every time to every table, you can just create a domain called the ID domain and keep on adding it to your entity tables, each entity table that you create. And by default, you would always have all your IDs across all the entities to be integer, having not nullable value. So that is the advantage of domain. You do not need to go and every time mention your describe the data type for every ID column you add. And the second advantage is that this prevents discrepancy. So by mistake, if somebody adds it to be a non-integer column, then this can be prevented. Any manual errors from the data modelers can be prevented. So that is the advantage of having a domain. So right click on this, say new, and you'll see that a domain by some number, random number has been created. I would just name it as an ID domain. Then select that domain that we have created, right click on it and say properties. Now here you can see that edit mode is logical. You can go to the physical mode as well. Let it be logical for now. What is the domain parent? It is default. Let it be I want the ID column to have numeric value, so I'll make the parent as number. So you can have your number icon. The name, you can also define the name that would be inherited by this attribute. So this is person attribute domain. As you have seen earlier, this is a macro. So person attribute domain is basically going to take the name of your attribute, right? And then I can change it. So let's make it person owner entity. Let's add that and see how it works over here. Okay. So I did that macro over here. Then let's go to the data type. Now I want to define a data type. I define the domain parent as number. So it has taken integer. I can define these other data types as well, which are available. Now this is going to be an ID column. So I want it to be not nullable. So I'm going to click on this. This will make it a non-nullable column. And then you have your constraint you can define. So we'll see it for another domain that we create. You can define and all that. So now I've created a domain called ID. I have defined some characteristics for that ID column. Let's go over here and say OK. Now let's go and create another entity over here. And let's call it tutors. So I've just created an entity. I'm calling it tutor. And now for all the entities that I keep on creating, I want to create an ID column, but I just want to go to my domain and add it. And by default, I should have the values of integer not nullable. Then just click on this and drag and drop over here. So now we can see that a column has been created and it's called tutors ID. And now it has taken its name as well. The name is basically your tutors, that is the owner entity name. This is my owner entity name and this is an integer ID over here. Now let's go and create another table called the, let's say, so we have the students, we have the courses, we have the tutors, then we have, let's say, another one called the clubs in your university. So it's a clubs table. And now if I go and add an ID column to the ID domain, again, just select this domain, drag and drop over here, then it would take the name is clubs ID. So by adding the person owner entity to the macro over here, we are making sure that each ID name is unique and it takes the entity name which we created. So data type, you had the general, we added the person owner entity over here. That is what is working over here. Now let's go and create another domain over here and see how we can set the validation rule for that. So again, go to domain, right click, say new, and now another name has popped up by some with some default characters. So I'm going to set it as, let's say, gender over here. So this is gender. I want to change the properties of this now. So go to right click, go to properties, and now gender. The first tab is who is the domain parent. So this is going to having string values. So I'm going to make the default parent as string over here. So this is your string. This is your domain icon. What's your attribute name? Again, I want to add the person owner entity to this so that my attribute names are more meaningful. Then I go to the data type. It's already defined as varchar. It's defined as 20. I can change the data length. I can make it, let's say, 1. I only want 1 character. I can define if I want it to be nullable or not nullable by clicking the checkbox over here. Then go to the next tab, that is the constraint tab. Now this constraint tab, you can see that there's something called the validation constraint. Now let's click over here and say yes. And you will see that there's another dialog box that pops up and it's called the validation rule. Now I can define a validation rule for the gender column because I only want, let's say, a limited set of values to ever enter into this column. So I can define, click on new over here, and I would see the validation rule again generated with some random number. So I can change it to a meaningful name. The gender, well, so whatever standard I have for naming a validation rule, or a better way would be validation rule underscore gender. And I want the same name for the physical data model as well. So just select it and say okay. Now this has added over here. Now if we go and take a look at the bottom section of the screen, you would see that there are different options. This is the type button. So what kind of validation rule we want, whether it's user defined, so you can enter your some expression, whether it's min or max, so you can confine to the ranges. You can define a range that I only want values from 1 to 100 or so on. And the other option is your valid values list. Now this is the most common option that we use. Here's what you can do is you can define a range of values. So it is a list of values that you can define, and your data entry into this column can only take one of these values. So now for this column, I want values, let's say like M, and the display value should be M as well. I can put a definition if I want over here. I want F and say F, and then I want to define a U, and that is my U. All right. So I can just go and say okay over here. And now I have a validation rule assigned to this column. And just go and say okay. Now if I want to add this column to the student table, I can just drag and drop this domain over here. So now I have the student gender added to this table. This is our child one. That is what we define. The domain is gender because that is the domain name that we have given. And if you click on this, in the attribute properties, the gender column, you can see data type that we define and that there is a constraint. And now since we define a validation rule around this domain, you can also see here on the left hand side in the validation rules, if you expand this, that a validation rule that we added has been added to this list as well. Okay. Now you can change the view to the physical view and you can see that all these columns have been added and everything. Now since we have a lot more tables now, I'm going to try this once again. Let's align them horizontally. So they are overlapping now. So let's select one table at a time. And wait. Okay. So I can also align spots. So I'm going to align these, let's say left align, and then I'm going to align these, let's say right align. Okay. So this makes it a better diagram. So this is all about domains. These are a very important property of the data model because they would help you reduce so much time, and as well they would help you define your standards and enforce those standards upon all the entities that you add so that there are minimal chances of any manual error that might happen. Now let's go back to the logical view over here and let's just delete these two tables for now. We do not need them. So let's say yes. So now I have these two tables, student and courses. Let me bring it on this side. This is my annotation. Let me keep it on up. Okay, it has disappeared. That's okay. There you go. Now I have this table as well, courses and student. Now I'm going to define a relationship between these two tables. So student and courses. The relationship is going to be like that a student can enroll into multiple courses. So here it is one to many. A student can enroll into multiple courses. That becomes a one to many. And a course can be taken by multiple students. So from this side as well, this is a one to many relationship. So for both of them, this is a one to many relationship. So what I'm going to define is a many to many relationship between these two tables. Now, if I go up over here on this section, I can see that there is something called an identifying relationship, then there is something called a many to many relationship, and there is something called a non-identifying relationship. So non-identifying relationship is basically it's a non-parent-child relationship. So it basically says that the two records in the table are not dependent on each other in terms of their existence, which means that a record in your child table or your second table can exist without a corresponding related record existing in your left table, which might be your parent table, which is the opposite in your identifying relationship, because identifying relationship basically gives you a parent-child relationship, and it says that a record in your child table can exist only if there is a parent record existing in your parent table. And the third is a many-to-many for the scenario that I've just described, that a student can enroll in multiple courses, a course can have multiple students enrolled in it, so that's a many-to-many relationship. So let's select the relationship that we want to create. So this is a many-to-many relationship. We want to create it between the student table, select that table, and the courses table, so select that table. So now many-to-many relationship has been created, and if I'm a data modeler or a technical team member just looking at the data model, how can I know that this is, because I will be just given a printout of this diagram. So how can I know it's a many-to-many relationship? By looking at these symbols over here. So you can see that there are multiple lines or three lines over here, and then three lines linking over here. So that signifies a many-to-many relationship. Now, many-to-many relationship, if you go to the physical data model, again, I have this relationship, but this is not implementable in a database as such with just two tables. For a many-to-many relationship, it has to be resolved. And here we have a concept of a bridge table or an association table that would be linking these two tables, and it would be a new table in itself, and it would have the ID columns or the primary ID columns of these two tables. So now what we can do is we can select this relationship that we have created, and if we go above to this section, we can see that there's something called a many-to-many transform. So if I click on this many-to-many transform, I can see that there's a dialog box again that opens up. It's a many-to-many transform wizard. If I just say next, next, and say finish, you will see that a table has been created and it's called the student underscore courses table, and it is now related to each of these tables. And the values that this is having are the student ID and the course ID, which are the primary keys of these two tables separately. And they have been in combination defined as a primary key for this table. Now let's say I do not want them as my primary key, so I'll just move them to the attributes section. Just select this column and move it down over here. Okay, then I have moved them to the attributes section. I want to create my own ID. I already have a domain. I can select that domain, pull it over here, and now I have my ID domain. Now this is my logical view. Let's go back to the physical view and check how it has come along. Again, I have the same thing. These are the foreign keys from these tables, and it is defined by a notation called FK, and I have pulled this over here. Now in many cases, we do not want this table, which is really required only for the physical implementation of the data model. So we do not want it to show in the logical data model. So how can I remove this from my logical data model and let there be just those two lines which directly signify that there is a many-to-many relationship between the student and the courses table. So again, I can go to the model over here, right click, go to its properties, and then we saw the general tab over here. Remember, we saw the general tab over here. We can go to this general tab, and then we can go to the transform options and say show source objects in logical, target objects in physical. So my source objects over here are the two tables, student and courses. The target objects are the relationship table as well. So if I select this, then it gives me more options that auto apply to many transform, auto apply to supertype, subtype, identity transform. This is a many transform. I'm going to select that and say okay. So now what has happened, I'm still in my logical view. That table, that association or link table or relationship table that was created has disappeared from the logical view. If I switch to the physical view, I can see that table is still there because it is needed for the physical implementation. So you can choose to have this kind of view wherein you transform, apply your transformation for the many-to-many transform, but you do not see that additional table, relationship table in your logical view, but you can see it in your physical view. Okay, so this is all about having the relationship or a many-to-many relationship. Now let's go back to the entity and right click over here, go back to the key groups. Now there's something called the key groups over here. What are these key groups? Key groups are nothing but indexes. So in the logical data model, the term for the key group for the indexes is the key group. So go and select the key groups over here, and you can see over here that this dialog box comes up. This is the entity that we have selected. You can change your entity over here. And then you have your key group. There's one key group that's already created that is called the XPK student. The type of key is the primary key as is defined over here. If we click on this show FK groups, okay, nothing happens, so that's okay. Then we have the option over here to define a new key as well. So I can click on this new key. And now primary key has already been defined. I cannot define more than one primary key, but what I can define are either the alternate key or the inversion entry key. Alternate keys are nothing but unique keys or some other columns in your table wherein you want to enforce the unique rule. So those columns, the values in those columns should always be unique. So you can create an alternate key in that case. Or if it's an inversion entry, then it's simply an index on that column, but it can have non-unique values. So you can have duplicate values in it. So let's create an inversion entry, a non-unique index. And now if I toggle between them, you can see that the default name that it's creating for the indexes is separate. So for the key group, it's giving XAK, and this AK basically signifies the alternate key. And for the inversion entry, it's giving IE, and IE is what it specifies for the inversion entry. So if we say OK, then the next thing it is showing is it has highlighted the inversion entry that I have created. It's asking me to, it's giving me a list of the available attributes, and it's asking me to add these attributes to the key group members. So let's say I want this inversion entry to be on the student name. I can just select it from here, click on this arrow button, and it will be added to the key group members, and say OK. So now I have a key, another inversion entry key created over here. Let's go back to the physical model and see how that key has come along. So again, we go to the columns, we select the columns, and then, sorry, not the column. Let's right click and select the indexes. So key group in a logical data model is equivalent to an index and a physical data model. So let's select on the indexes, and we can see that there is this index called the XE1 student that we just created. So that index is there. Is it unique? It's showing here. Is it unique or not? It's not unique because that's an inversion entry index, and then you have a primary key index that's unique. If you do show FK indexes, and okay, we have to select some of the tables for that. Let's go over here, student courses, go to indexes. Okay, your show FK indexes. So here you can see that this is now IF1 and IF2 because these are foreign key indexes. If I remove that, then I can only see the primary key index. If I put over this over here, if I want to see the foreign keys as well, which are added over here, then I can see these two indexes as well. So these are the indexes. You can create your key groups or indexes as well when you create your data model. So that is another important property of your data model. So I'm just going to close this. Now we have taken a look at the domains, how you create the domains, how you create the entities, add columns, define data types, create domains, create relationships, and so on. So all these things, once we have done all these things, and we have, let's say we are comfortable now creating the data model. So we have, let's say, created the data model. Then what is the next step? What is the next step? The next step is to implement this data model in our database. Now, how can I implement this data model in a database? If I just go and print this version out of the physical data model and give it to my DBA, he will not be able to implement because he wants SQL scripts to be created, and he wants those SQL scripts that would be needed to create these tables, add attributes to these tables, and these should be similar to the ones or exactly the same as the ones that we have defined. So our job as a data modeler now is to create a script for the DBA team, which they can use to insert, which they can use to create this data model in the physical database. So now I can go to the tools, and if I go to the tools, I can see that there are options called the forward engineering options. So forward engineering options, or I can also see the forward engineering option over here, okay, on my toolbar. So let's just click on that forward engineering option. So this forward engineering option, once you click on that, it's showing you different details and what are your options, what all SQLs you want in your statement. So if you select on schema, it's giving you all these options. On the trigger, it is giving you all these options. Indexes, it is giving you all these options. Tables, it is giving you all these options. So whatever it is, it has, by default, it has made something. And these selections that it has made are stored in this option set, which is the default schema generation, which is provided by default by Erwin. You can create your own, and then you can open that. If you have created anything, you can open that and use your selections of these various options. So now let's go with the default schema generation, and let's say how this works. So if you want to directly go and create your data model in your database, you can simply go and click on generate over here. Once you click on generate, it will ask you all these connection properties. So I want to connect it to the SQL Server database because I defined this data model to be the SQL Server data model. Then it's asking for your login credentials. So once you provide that, you connect. These tables would be automatically created in your physical database. But before doing that, what we want to check once is what all you just want to check or preview the SQL that is getting generated for this physical data model. So what we can do over here is we can go to the preview button and select the preview, and it gives you all the SQL that has been generated. If I maximize that, you can see that there is some create type, there is some create rule that we define. These are the domains. So these are the types in the physical database. It has created those domains. It has created the validation rules. Then it has created your table. This is your table courses, and then you have the column name for the course ID, the data type, the nullability, then another attribute name. Go. Then you have an alter table statement that's your alter table, add constraint, XPK courses, primary key, clustered. So now it has added that constraint. So your primary key is now a constraint over here, added as a constraint over here. So you can go down to create table student, and then you have your student ID, student name, birth date, student gender, and so on. So this is what information we have got. Now what I want is I want to make some changes. If you go down over here, you will see that at the end there are some Erwin built-in triggers, which I do not want. So I can just remove the. I want to remove these. Also, I want to make some changes to the way primary key is generated over here. So I can, instead of having it as an alter table statement, I want it to be a part of the create table statement. So let's just close this and make those changes by making changes to these selections over here. So first was the trigger. So I go to trigger, and I do not want the Erwin generated triggers to be included in my SQL. So I can just go and uncheck this block. So no Erwin generated triggers will now be included in the SQL. Then let's go to the indexes. Indexes are primary key, alternate key, which is fine. Let's go to the referential integrity. Now, in the referential integrity, you can see that the selections by default are that for the creation of the primary key, it is created as an alter primary key statement, alter statement. I want it to be a create statement, so I'll just go and click on the create button. All right. Similarly, for the foreign key, I want it to be for create foreign key statement. Have the unique key, I want it to be a create unique key statement. Now, any table level changes do I want? I want create table. That's okay. I want all these things. Then columns, I want all this. Okay, that's okay. Views I do not have currently. Okay, so let's go with all these changes. Now, all these changes, as I said, I have made some changes to this default schema generation. If I do not want to alter this file, I can save these changes or save as. When you do save as, you can save it as an XML file, and then you can use that, open that XML file over here, and the next time you generate the model, these references that we have set over here would be automatically saved, and you do not need to make these changes every time you generate this option. Okay, so let's do a preview now. Once that we have made all these changes, let's do a preview over here, and let's maximize this. And you can see that these are the create domains, and okay, you can see that these are your domains have been created. So then your validation rule has been created, your create table student. Let's look at the create table student over here. So now what has changed is that your primary key is now a part of your create table student. It's not a separate alter statement. And then you have your index created over here. Similarly, for the create table courses and the student courses, even your foreign keys are part of your create table statement now. They are not separate alter table statements. So this is how it would change. Changing your preferences would change. Now let's say now I'm satisfied with the SQL that has been generated and I want to go ahead and generate this in the database, in the physical database. So I can just click on the generate button over here, directly over here as well. Or as would happen in many standard projects or big time projects, a data modeler would not have the access to create these data models tables directly in the physical database. Only a DBA would have it. So you can share the script with the DBA and he can use the script and make any modifications if necessary as far as the database specific characteristics are concerned, consult with you again, and then he can create this data model. Now the next thing that we can see here is basically that let's say we have already created this database model and a physical database. So what we can do is, now I have only altered one table. So now I only want to generate the SQL statement for one table. So what I can do is I can do a filter over here and I can choose which tables I want. So now I have all the tables are already here. So I do not want the course table. Let's say I do not want the student courses table. I've only made some changes to the student table. So I can have that filter and then I can, if I do a preview, then you will see that only the SQL statement that is related to the student table has been generated. So this is basically used when you're altering your data model. So there is only a specific set of tables that you have altered, or only a specific set of statements, only a specific set of statements that you want to generate. Then you can use this option for forward engineering. So this is about forward engineering as well. So we made the changes in the same thing. So it is saying that, it is giving that message. So we are okay with that. Now you will see that there's also another option called the reverse engineer over here. That is basically you take an existing data model from your physical database, or if you have it in some other format, and then you make changes to that. So it's different. It's the opposite of the forward engineering process. In the forward engineering process, we are taking the data model from Erwin and generating it in the database. In the reverse engineering process, we are taking it from the database and making some changes and continue our work with that model. So that is the difference between the forward engineering and the reverse engineering process.